Sarah had worked at Miller's Diner for almost 7 years. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small roadside diner on the edge of town. But it had become her second home. Every morning, she arrived early to start the coffee pot, wipe the tables, and greet the truckers who stopped by before sunrise. People liked her for her warm smile and calm nature. She never raised her voice, no matter how busy things got. And she always found a kind word for everyone who came through the door. That Friday evening had been long. The rush hour crowd had stayed later than usual, and the new dishwasher had called in sick. By closing time, Sarah was tired but stayed behind to finish cleaning the kitchen. She needed the extra hours. Her teenage son, Ben, had recently started college, and tuition didn't pay itself. She often told herself that a little extra work today would make tomorrow easier for him. The diner grew quiet after everyone left. The neon sign outside flickered softly, throwing pink light across the front windows. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and grilled cheese sandwiches. Sarah stacked the last of the dishes, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to take out the trash. She pushed open the back door that led into the narrow alley behind the diner. The night air was cool and a little damp. The sound of crickets filled the space, mixed with the distant hum of passing cars on the highway. Normally, it was peaceful out there, but tonight felt a little different. Something about the stillness made her uneasy. She looked around and noticed a group of young men standing near the far end of the alley. Just outside the reach of the diner's dim light, they were laughing loudly, passing around a soda can, and one of them kicked a rock across the pavement. Sarah didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just waiting for someone. She pulled her cardigan closer and tried to focus on her work. She tied the trash bag and dragged it toward the dumpster. As she lifted it, she heard one of the men call out, "Hey, you work here?" His voice startled her. It wasn't rude, but it wasn't friendly either. Sarah forced a small smile and said softly, "Yes, sir." Just closing up, she hoped that would end the conversation. But they didn't stop talking. Another one chuckled and said something to his friend that she couldn't make out. Their laughter echoed strangely against the walls. She felt her heartbeat quicken. She told herself not to overthink. They were probably harmless. Still, she decided to finish quickly. She reached for the second bag, but her hand trembled a little. When she turned back toward the door, she realized the men had moved closer, slowly. But enough that she noticed. She swallowed hard. The diner's back door had locked automatically when she stepped out, a habit meant to keep the kitchen secure after hours. The front entrance was round the corner, but that meant walking past them. She looked for her phone, but it was inside on the counter next to the cash register. One of the men stepped forward. He was tall, wearing a jacket with torn sleeves. "You here all alone?" he asked. His voice sounded casual, but his eyes didn't. Sarah hesitated before answering. "Just cleaning up," she said quietly, trying to sound calm. She hoped her tone would make them lose interest. The air around her felt heavier. Their laughter grew quieter, replaced by whispers she couldn't hear clearly. Sarah backed away until her shoulder brushed against the wall behind the dumpster. She could see the flickering diner light reflected in a small puddle on the ground. For a moment, she wished she had waited for the manager to walk her out like he sometimes did. Before she could decide what to do, a sound came from the shadows near the far end of the alley. The sharp scrape of a shoe against gravel. A voice followed, deep and steady. "Hey, what's going on back here?" The men turned sharply. Sarah did too. Out of the shadows stepped an older man, Frank, the diner's night cook. He was in his late 50s, quiet, the kind of person who said little but always noticed everything. Sarah hadn't realized he was still around. Usually, he left right after closing. "Frank?" she said, relief flooding her chest. He nodded once and looked at her before turning his eyes toward the men. "Something wrong, fellas?" he asked evenly. His tone wasn't loud, but there was something firm about it. The kind of calm confidence that comes from someone who's seen too much to be afraid. The tallest man laughed. "No problem, old man," he said, though his grin didn't look real. "We're just talking." Frank didn't move closer. He just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at them. "Then maybe it's time to call it a night," he said simply. The men exchanged looks. One of them muttered something Sarah couldn't hear. For a few seconds, no one moved. The silence stretched until even the crickets seemed to stop. Sarah could feel tension in the air, heavy and strange, like the quiet before a thunderstorm. Then something unexpected happened. The tallest man blinked hard and shook his head, as if dizzy. Another rubbed his temples. "What's—" he began, but the words slurred. His friend reached for his arm, but his hand missed. One by one, their balance slipped. Sarah gasped. "Frank, what's happening to them?" He didn't answer right away. He stepped closer to her instead, putting a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said softly. "They'll be fine." Sarah stared as the men swayed, confused and unsteady. None of them seemed hurt, just dazed, like people trying to wake from a deep dream. Within moments, they dropped to their knees, then slowly to the ground. Sarah covered her mouth, unable to believe what she was seeing. Frank stayed calm. "Call the sheriff," he said gently. "Tell them there's been an incident in the back lot." Sarah nodded quickly and rushed inside to get her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed the number. By the time she returned, the men were lying still on the ground, their breathing slow and even. Frank stood nearby, arms folded, watching quietly. The expression on his face was unreadable. Not angry, not scared, just distant. The flashing red and blue lights appeared 10 minutes later. Officers stepped out, confused by what they saw. "They're not drunk?" one asked after checking them. "Not injured?" "No," Frank replied quietly. "They'll wake up soon." Sarah stood off to the side, clutching her phone. She kept glancing at Frank. He seemed different somehow, calm in a way that made her wonder if he knew more than he let on. When one of the officers asked what had happened, Frank said only, "I came back for my wallet." "Found them like this?" Sarah frowned. That wasn't true. He had arrived after everything started. But she didn't say anything. She looked down at her shoes, thinking maybe it was better not to question it right now. One of the paramedics checked the young men and said their heartbeats were steady, like they just fell asleep. He murmured as the officers took notes. Sarah caught Frank's eye. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave her a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Get some rest, Sarah," he said. "You've had a long day." When she turned to look back a moment later, Frank was gone. She asked one of the officers if they had seen where he went, but they hadn't. It was as if he disappeared into the night. Sarah stayed until the paramedics loaded the men into the ambulance. Then she walked back inside the diner. The clock on the wall showed 12:45 a.m. The coffee pot was still warm. She sat at the counter, her hands trembling, replaying everything that had just happened. She thought about how Frank had looked at the men, about how they fell without anyone touching them. She thought about the strange stillness in the air and the faint hum she had heard right before they collapsed, like static electricity or the vibration of power lines. By the time she locked up and turned off the lights, her heart had slowed down, but her mind was still racing. She walked home beneath the streetlights, glancing over her shoulder once or twice. The quiet town looked the same as always, calm, ordinary, peaceful. But for Sarah, nothing felt ordinary anymore. When she reached her small apartment, her son Ben was asleep on the couch with his books scattered around him. She covered him with a blanket and stood there for a long moment, listening to his breathing. Finally, she whispered to herself, "Thank you, Frank," though she wasn't sure who or what she was thanking anymore. That night, before she fell asleep, Sarah saw something in her dream, the alley behind the diner, the soft flicker of the neon light, and Frank standing there with his hands in his pockets, watching her with kind but distant eyes. When she woke up, she wasn't sure if it had been a dream at all. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, though she had barely slept. The sunlight crept through the thin curtains, casting soft lines across her small apartment. For a few moments, she sat on the edge of her bed, trying to make sense of what had happened the night before. The sounds, the lights, the way those men had suddenly fallen asleep, it all felt too strange to be real. She even wondered for a second if she had dreamed it. But when she turned on the morning news, there it was, mysterious incident at Miller's Diner. authorities still searching for answers. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured her coffee. The newscaster explained that the men had been examined and released from the hospital. Early that morning, doctors said there was nothing wrong with them, no drugs, no illness, no injuries. They all claimed they had no memory of what happened after they saw a bright flash. Near the back lot, Sarah shook her head slowly. She didn't remember any flash, just Frank's voice and that deep calm in the air. Her son Ben walked into the kitchen, still half asleep. "Mom, you're up early," he mumbled. She smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep." He noticed the TV. "Hey, that's your diner," he said. "Were you there?" Sarah hesitated, not wanting to worry him. "Yeah, I was there, but everything's fine now," he frowned. "You sure?" She nodded quickly. "Just a little excitement, that's all. Nothing to worry about." She ruffled his hair and tried to change the subject. But inside, she couldn't stop thinking about Frank, how he had appeared so suddenly, how calm he was, and how he disappeared before anyone could question him later that day. She walked to the diner. A police car was parked outside, and 2 officers were talking to the manager. When they saw Sarah, one of them smiled kindly. "Ms. Turner, good morning. We were hoping to talk to you again." She led them to a booth by the window, and they asked her to describe everything she remembered. She told them about hearing the voices, seeing the men move closer, and Frank showing up just in time. She told them how they seemed to fall asleep, but she left out her feeling that something else had happened, something beyond explanation. "Frank," one of the officers repeated, looking at his notes. "Do you have his full name?" "Frank Dawson," she replied. "He's our night cook. Worked here for years." The officer looked at her curiously. "Are you sure about that?" Sarah frowned. "Of course. He's worked here since before I joined." The manager, Mr. Keaton, came over and looked puzzled. "Frank Dawson?" he said slowly. "Sarah, Frank retired last December. He moved to Arizona. You even signed the farewell card." The color drained from her face. "That's not possible," she whispered. "He was here last night." The officers exchanged a glance. "We checked employee records," one said gently. "Mr. Dawson hasn't been on the payroll for almost a year." Sarah sat in silence. Her mind spun. She remembered his voice, the way he touched her shoulder, the smell of his jacket faintly like cooking oil and coffee. All of it had felt so real. "Maybe he came back to visit," she said softly. "Maybe he was just passing through." But the manager shook his head. "He never came back. His nephew sent me a Christmas card last month. Frank's been living in Phoenix, helping at his sister's cafe." Sarah didn't know what to say. She could tell the officers didn't want to push her, but their eyes said they didn't believe her story. After they left, she went into the kitchen and stood near the spot where Frank always used to work. The metal counter was spotless, just like he used to keep it. She closed her eyes for a moment and whispered, "Thank you, Frank, whoever you are." The next few days passed quietly. The story spread around town, and everyone had their own theory. Some said the men had been playing a prank and passed out from panic. Others believed it was a medical mystery. A few whispered that Sarah had guardian angels watching over her. She didn't know what to believe, but deep inside, she knew what she saw and who she saw. One night, a week later, she stayed late again, though this time she made sure to lock the back door and keep her phone in her pocket. The town had gone back to normal. The same truckers came for coffee, the same families for pie. But every now and then, she caught herself looking at the alley through the small back window. Nothing unusual ever happened again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching over her. Then, one Thursday morning, she found something strange. When she arrived to open the diner, she saw an envelope tucked under the back door. Her name was written on it in neat handwriting. She opened it carefully. Inside was a folded note on plain white paper. It read, "You're safe now. Don't work late alone anymore." Her heart stopped for a second. The handwriting was unmistakable, Frank's. She had seen it on recipe cards and old order slips. She ran her fingers over the letters again and again, just to be sure. The paper even smelled faintly of the same aftershave Frank used to wear. When she showed the note to Mr. Keaton, he stared at it, then shook his head slowly. "Sarah, that's strange," he said. "I told you, Frank hasn't been here. Maybe he came back," she insisted. "Maybe he didn't want to make a fuss," Mr. Keaton sighed. "If he did, he didn't tell anyone. But I'll admit, that's his handwriting." Sarah folded the note and put it in her apron pocket. All day, she kept touching it, just to make sure it was still there. It made her feel safe. Somehow that evening, one of the officers came back for a follow-up. He said the men from that night had been questioned again, and their stories hadn't changed. They couldn't remember anything. They said they saw an older man step out from the shadows, the officer said slowly. Then one of them felt dizzy, and everything went black. He paused, watching Sarah. They all described him the same way, short gray hair, wearing a diner uniform, calm voice. "Does that sound familiar?" Sarah nodded. That was Frank. The officer scribbled something in his notebook, then looked up. "Ma'am, we checked the cameras across the street. They show you taking out the trash, then those men approaching. And then the lights flicker for about 15 seconds. After that, the men are lying on the ground. You run inside, and he stopped. And what?" she asked. "There's no one else on the footage," he said carefully. "Just you." Sarah stared at him. "That's not possible. Frank was there." He closed the notebook slowly. "Maybe he was, ma'am. Maybe not in the way we understand." That night, Sarah sat alone at one of the diner booths long after closing. The street outside was quiet, just a few cars passing by. She took the note from her pocket and laid it on the table. The edges were slightly worn from how many times she had unfolded it. She looked at the handwriting again and whispered, "Thank you." She thought about Frank, how kind he'd always been, how he used to hum old songs while cooking, how he once told her, "Some people leave, but they never really go far." Maybe he had meant something deeper than she realized. Weeks passed. The news stopped covering the story, and the town moved on. But every night before closing, Sarah felt a strange comfort in that quiet alley. It didn't feel scary anymore. It felt peaceful, like someone invisible was standing there, keeping watch. One rainy evening, a new delivery driver stopped by. He was young, cheerful, and curious about the story he'd heard. "You were the lady in that diner mystery, right?" he asked. Sarah smiled shyly. "That's what people say. What do you think happened?" He asked. She wiped the counter slowly and said, "I think sometimes help comes from where we least expect it. And sometimes people we care about aren't as far away as we think." The driver nodded, impressed. "That's deep," he said with a grin, and then left with his boxes. Later that night, when Sarah stepped outside to lock up, the rain had stopped. The air was cool, and the sky was full of stars. She looked down the alley where everything had happened. The puddle by the dumpster reflected the diner's neon sign. For a moment, she thought she saw a faint shape there, the outline of a man with gray hair and a calm smile. But when she blinked, it was gone. She smiled softly. "Good night, Frank," she whispered. Then she turned, locked the door, and walked home under the glowing street lights. Life went on. The diner stayed busy. Ben graduated from college, and Sarah eventually managed to buy a small house near the park. Every time she felt afraid or uncertain, she remembered that night and the strange way help had arrived. It reminded her that even in dark places, there was still light, sometimes quiet, sometimes unseen, but always there. Years later, when the diner celebrated its 50th anniversary, Sarah brought an old photo album from the early days. There was a picture of the staff lined up in front of the neon sign. She smiled when she saw it. There was Frank, standing off to the side with his usual calm smile, one hand tucked into his pocket. She framed that photo and hung it in the hallway of her new home. Underneath it, she taped the note that had once been left for her. The handwriting still clear. The message still simple. "You're safe now. Don't work late alone anymore." Every time she walked past it, she felt a quiet peace. She never knew exactly what had happened that night behind the diner, but maybe she didn't need to. Some things, she thought, were not meant to be explained. They were meant to be remembered, and so she did, every night, with gratitude and a small smile, remembering the man who had appeared just when she needed him most, and who somehow reminded her that goodness never truly disappears. It just changes form and finds its way back, often in the quietest, most unexpected moments.